Welcome to the Ash Cloud. I'm Ash Sweeting. Our food systems are orders of magnitude more complex than other sectors of our economy. So how can tools such as artificial intelligence help farmers across the world make better decisions to improve the sustainability and productivity of our food systems? Today we are joined by Aidan Connolly, an animal agtech entrepreneur, investor, and author of The Future of Agriculture, who has spent his career working on agricultural innovation. Aidan, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you. Yeah, my pleasure.
Technology and agriculture and the innovation in this space. What are you seeing as the most exciting innovations with the work that you're currently doing?
I think the world of innovation, by its nature, is changing every moment. I would say that artificial intelligence is pretty obviously the most exciting area for us. I've always seen it as being the glue that pulls together the different disparate parts of the digital chain. You know, what do you do when you get sensors or from robotics or from even from a blockchain? How do you make decisions? How does that change the role of a nutritionist or agronomist or a veterinarian? I feel that artificial intelligence was always the thing we talked about, but clearly it's bringing more and more to the table, and how that might disrupt agriculture, particularly livestock agriculture that I focus a lot on, is really, to my mind, is very, very, very interesting. And that is the feature of most of the conferences I've been to recently. I was at one in China this last weekend that was attended by 3 million people online. So, kind of on the larger side, 3,000 people in person. And they had an internet influencer, um, Yin Bong, who is followed by 50 million people on as a social media person himself, and really, really interested in agriculture, really interested in the future of food production. But again, artificial intelligence seemed to come up in presentations by himself, the FAO, and indeed my own presentations at the event.
So artificial intelligence is something that gets talked about a lot, but not is I think there's lots to it too, that not everyone necessarily understands the details of what it actually is and how it works. So could we just take a little step back and dig into a bit of firstly, what is artificial intelligence? How does it work? And then where are the opportunities for that to change or revolutionize the way that we manage our farms and agricultural systems?
Actually, very perceptive questions. As you know, an awful lot of people who you see at these events standing up on stage and they use the phrase AI have absolutely no idea what they're talking about. Some of us are hopefully humble enough to think we know something, but realize we actually don't know that much either. But I did like Seth Godin's um, phrase, which was that artificial intelligence is neither artificial nor intelligent. And his purpose in pointing that out was to say, behind almost every AI system on the planet today, there are people fixing things. So whether it's through annotation, whether that's through just watching to make sure you don't get algorithmic drift, or you get biases being introduced, or the databases which we're using to inform our insights are actually balanced. All of these things can happen. And even if you've worked with artificial intelligence in its original forms, I'd say 10, 20 years ago, but let's just say even from to be more shocking and more controversial, 3 years ago, 5 years ago, it's probably moved on tremendously since then. I did head up a company, Caintus, which was using AI to identify the behavior of cows, particularly looking at sitting, lying, eating, drinking, and then obviously separately looked at the consumption of feed indirectly by seeing the feed disappearance from the bunk. And I get a real sense of just how expensive some of this is, of how consuming it is from a resources perspective, and how complicated it is. And whenever somebody says to me, I can use I'm working on an AI system and I spent a few $100,000 or spent a few $1 million, I've often been known to say, that's very nice. You bought you bought a ticket to the AI club, but you haven't yet purchased a beer at the bar, because those unfortunately are just table stakes in what is not inexpensive technology. But anyway, sorry if that's a little rambling. I'm just trying to say, to start off by saying, I think you're absolutely right. We talk a lot about it. We're not always as clear as to what it is and how it's going to help us. And that's going to be for me a lot of the big leaps that we're going to make now in the next couple of years.
So my understanding of AI in the most basic fashion, and please steer me in the right direction when I am not correct in this, is that it's essentially pattern recognition technology. So you have a bunch of data in some data set, which could be the entire internet or it could be something smaller, and you develop algorithms that identify patterns that link different things. So in your case, those patterns would be potentially, the visual and image of that a certain cow links to that cow's identity, or the from the pixels that you're pulling out of those images, you identify things like whether the cow is sitting down or standing up or eating, or those sorts of things. And then the algorithms generate correlations, which will have various different levels of accuracy between um, these patterns that they're identifying, and there can be causation with some of those things, and there can be just random correlations as well. So that goes back to the accuracy side of things. Is that a very basic understanding of what AI is, or am I way off the mark?
I like that, and I think that's how I would reason it as well. And I think you've picked out one of the key challenges when it comes to agriculture, which is it causation or is it correlation? We are currently seeing a number of startups that analyze the sounds that animals make, and from that come to some fairly strong conclusions about the prevalence of disease or stress or well-being of the animal, but we're not actually fully sure whether those things are really correlated or not. Quite often, I mean, the fact that a pig is unhappy, is it unhappy because it's hungry? Is it unhappy because it's seen a rodent? Is it unhappy because its tail was bitten by another pig? Or is it unhappy because it's got African swine fever? Sometimes I see these things in presentations, I'm sure you do as well, from companies who've got great ideas but don't practically understand how unlikely it is to be able to predict specific diseases from very indirect factors. And yet that's where we are today. And the power of AI may be to get us closer, but those patterns may or may not signify what we're hoping that they signify, which is the ability to detect some of these bigger problems.
So I think what you're kind of opening up in terms of the conversation is that connection between the AI and the algorithms and what those are telling us, because at the end of the day, a computer or a multiple computers can analyze amounts and volumes of data that are just orders and orders of magnitude greater and larger and more complex than what an individual human can look at. But then you need to link that into human decision making, because at the end of the day, a human is going to treat the pig or give it some extra food or put the band-aid on the tail per se, or do something about the African swine fever. And then you also need to link that into other research and information systems that will um, I guess, ground truth or ascertain what is actually happened. Do you need to have a PCR test, say, or another viral test that will actually diagnose the African swine fever, or some other sensor in the trough, or whatever those other bits and pieces of information and technology? So you're kind of linking this power of AI, but back into humans, and how that will help humans make better decisions.
The two pieces I would pick out in what you've just said. Firstly, for those that have not worked in AI, there is a presumption that more data is good, and that we simply cram more data into the funnel, we're going to get better sausages at the other end, which is definitely not true. The quality of data that goes in, the ability to curate the data, carefully removing extraneous data that can lead to the wrong conclusions, and equally make sure that the data is not simply creating a insights on a specific situation in a specific farm in a specific conditions that are so specific that you don't get any real value out of it. The second problem we have is particularly agriculture. I've often used the phrase that we have a lot of unknown unknowns, to obviously play off the phrase of known knowns and known unknowns. Well, we definitely have unknown unknowns, and the more we're learning, the more we realize how little we know. This table's full of soil that contain 8 billion microorganisms, which not only are 8 million microorganisms, but can influence the cereals, the crops that are grown in those fields, the bacteria on the skin of a pig or a chicken or a cow are in their environment that can influence how they react to nutrition. So I'm particularly thinking of this because I've started working with a veterinarian who's got a great idea for looking at replicating the diseases that he sees in the field, and where he will sometimes do postmortems on animals to see how those have changed. And as I've gone through it with him to try to think through how we'd replicate this using AI, he basically in his head reviews 400 possible scenarios. And it's multifactorial, it's extremely complex. And he's effectively using, I hesitate to use the phrase gut feel, but he's using his gut and his 30 years, 40 years of experience to make a diagnosis as to what's being seen. Trying to get a system, an AI system, to replicate that is nothing like as easy as I thought it would be. And I think that it's critical we do this, because a lot of what we've relied upon is something that I learned in college 30 years ago when I was sitting in lecture hall and I heard my professor say this, and maybe I was asleep, or maybe I was distracted, or maybe I didn't read the right chapter. So that learned book learning is there, or the learning that we gain from watching other people, or the knowledge we get being handed down from father to son or mother to child. That sort of learning is all exists in agriculture. That's not going to be effectively what we need to do in the future. So the promise of AI is obviously to make better decisions than humans make, with less errors, with less mistakes due to omission or commission, and equally the ability to just not get fatigued, to continue to make those decisions better and better over time. That's the real power of what we have it or can have in our hands in a very uncertain business. But equally, I just want to repeat the same things. It is just not going to be easy to do. It's just we have this imagination. We're dealing with a pharmaceutical factory or car factory. We are dealing with agriculture. It's got lots and lots of things that just are out of our control.
Going back to what you said, I completely agree with you on the complexity of that. And going back to what you said on the microbiome, be that on the soil, in the soil, or in on the skins of or the guts of animals, one, there are those billions of microbes there. The other side of it is, our current knowledge of microbiology is that we actually don't even know what a lot of them are. But also they're dynamic, they're constantly changing. What's there 1 minute is different to what's there the next minute, and we're never going to be able to censor and monitor all of them because that's just the sensors and the ability to do that is not possible. So it then comes down to what are the key bits of data that we need to put into those algorithms, and what are the key outcomes that we need from that data, um, that are going to change decision making or improve decision making. So how do you think through that nexus and those challenges?
If you look at outcomes, unfortunately, I'm trying to remember something I read earlier today saying that humans are increasingly making decisions faster and faster with less information, maybe the overload of our society, we want to be able to say Clostridia is bad, E. coli is bad, Lactobacillus is good, Pediococcus is good, Bifidobacteria are good. And you start to understand after a period of time that's just not quite that simple. So we are being confronted by things that are not what we learned, not what we want to believe, and don't allow for the simplicity of saying, let's kill the bad things and let's favor the good things, and suddenly we'll all be happy. As that evolves, I think again AI can play a role in our understandings of what we should feed, when we should feed it, the kind of the right time, right place, right nutrient approach that we've taken in crops. We're doing that, need to do that increasingly in livestock. The complexity of how one nutrient like a fiber can influence on the absorption of something else like a protein. That's another part, particularly in ruminant animals, in dairy cows and beef cattle, goats and sheep. There's even more complexity because of the way the stomachs, these various stomachs work. Um, but at the end, I still like looking at outcomes such as, well, the basics: more milk, more meat, more eggs. Not everybody loves that idea, but that makes food more affordable, and it's usually a sign that the animal's healthy. Obviously, greater understanding of health will be critical. The influence on the quality of the produce. So that could be something as simple as the shelf life of our eggs or milk and our meat. And eventually we're starting to get into also understanding precision nutrition from a human perspective, a scary thought. I'm joking, of course, but the realization that maybe many of the choices we make as humans from a nutrition perspective are not well informed, and if we start to inform those, we may be consuming animal products which have been designed more appropriately for our health and for the outcomes we want as humans.
There are lots of very interesting things that you said just then. So I'm not quite sure exactly where to go next, but um, where I will go is that the nutritional side of our food systems, because at the end of the day, we produce food so that we can feed ourselves and have and be healthy. And there's growing evidence that the more simplistic models or dietary requirements based on energy, protein, fat, salt, etc. um are somewhat simplistic, and there's many more molecules within our foods that impact our metabolism. And secondly, that the way that food is grown will impact the nutrient density of food. And the the information that I'm sourcing here is from the Bionutrient Food Association, where they looked essentially that the highest correlation was that the more biodiverse and complex the ground in terms of cover crops, etc., that crops were grown in had a positive correlation with increased nutrient density, and a more biodiverse diet for livestock, for cattle, increase the nutrient density of the meat and the milk. So, in terms of linking I see AI as a very valuable tool in terms of, linking those patterns to try and understand how that works and then feeding that into human nutrition. I'd just be interested in your thoughts on that.
Well, sometimes I think more deeply about whether we get ourselves to a situation where the nutrition we are allowed to consume becomes mandated by choice outside of my head or your head or wallets. And does that happen through doctors? Does that happen through insurance? Does that happen through governments? What's absolutely clear to me is that again, we have lived in this paradise of probably misinformed information, saying eat less fat, consume more something else, which tends to be sugar. um, et cetera, which probably have led to some of the outcomes in the fact that the average American lifespan has declined over the last 3 years is pretty shocking. And I see some of the same trends are currently happening in other countries. To what degree will that return us to some form of food that's better for us? I don't know. I mean, there's arguments that people make for organic. Some days I believe some of that, and some days I find it more challenging to believe it. Certainly, the further processed foods are under tremendous attack. Um, People are arguing that is our problem with consumption of meat that we eat too much of it, or is it that we're eating too much processed meat? So there's lots of interesting parts like this. But again, when I deal with the chicken's life is not very long. Its consumption of nutrients is so well controlled and so uniform that I know to some degree the outcomes. And I could argue the same thing about pigs and maybe dairy and fish and other livestock species. In humans, the mistakes we make nutritionally are for argument's sake, the decision to take up smoking or drinking excessively can take 30 or 40 years for the damage to be seen. So it's going to always be extremely difficult for a human to make choices for themselves when the consequences of bad decisions take so long. And again, not to replay the same refrain, but I think that's where artificial intelligence and better data and better collection of information will allow us to make, I think, better decisions, certainly from a human perspective, um, than we are currently doing.
So how do we, yeah, this is obviously how long's a piece of string question, but we've got multiple factors going on. We've obviously got our own health. We've got the productivity and the livelihoods of the farmers and ranchers who are growing and producing the food. We've got the social and cultural environments that they live in and the traditions that those people have. And then we've got the environment and the health of the climate as another big factor. So, and then we've got people running around, making decisions, as you said, on more and more quickly on less and less information. So, you know, from there's a lot of complexity in there. So where do we, how do we break that down and where do we start and how do we start to build that into areas where we can have impact and then use technologies like AI to get those gains, to get the confidence for people to use it more frequently and grow the whole pie.
Um, yeah, how do you hold on to the tail of the tiger? Um, I probably, well, I know I'm a very optimistic person, and I believe that these trends that we see tend to lead to good outcomes. I know that a lot of people are uncomfortable with the increasing size of our farms, the fact that we have typically more animals on sites, that we are seeing less and less of the small farms. But I happen to believe those smaller farms have got a bigger environmental problem. The carbon footprint certainly of cows in farms where you've one or two cows in a relatively unproductive settings is infinitely higher per cow than a very productive cow on a large farm. It could make the same argument certainly that chickens in a environmentally controlled house, being fed properly, being watered properly, given drinking water properly, with good quality litter, is much more likely to happen on a large productive farm than it is on a small farm. It also, I think, is true that the welfare of those animals can be better. Now, we have seen things happen, which may be the unintended consequences of industrialization of food production, which I don't think have been good. And you've pointed out, the soil thing. Let's say we choose to grow plants in soils, and we, in our wisdom, decided that they required nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium NPK fertilizer. We never thought about selenium and boron, and we never thought about uh, copper and manganese and zinc and all the micro elements. And we certainly never thought about the soil health. We certainly never thought about the aeration of that soil. And these are all really interesting ideas that I think are coming to the fore and can be married together with productive agriculture. Because when you show it to somebody who wants to produce more with their land, they go, well, actually, I'm starting to see as to how this fits together with what I need to do. So I feel that the desire for more affordable food to more people in the world, to more nutritious food, requires us to do a better job of treating our plants well, treating our animals well, treating our planet well. So I'm, as you can gather, optimistic that that push will be favourable. And in order to get there, we need to be more precise. And the only way to be more precise in, well, how much water does a plant need? How much protein does an animal need to consume before it starts to belch or uh, emit some of that in the form of ammonia or methane? All of those, I think farmers are on the same side as environmentalists and the same side as those who want to get food into the mouths of hungry people. Um, but so that precision, I think, again, will come from better use of information, and I think it's being embraced. It's just a it's just a question of how we can help it happen faster and keep in mind to not allow the unintended consequences of sometimes free market decisions which were taken in the right for the right reasons but lead to the wrong outcomes.
As you said earlier, you've recently, or just the other day, last this week, you've been in China. You travel quite extensively, and who do you see, both from countries or regions, and also in terms of individuals, be that companies or researchers, who are leading the field in this space?
Mm, I'm not going to give you names because I don't think that would be appropriate. I'd give you countries. I would say I'm really impressed with Israel. Um, I'm not sure they have a plan, but they achieve extraordinary things because of the way that you meet 12 and 13-year-old Israelis and you ask them what they want to do when they grow up, and they say run a startup. Um, they're not looking to work for a bank, and they're not looking to work for a you know an IT or AI superpower from the beginning of their lives. They're quite open to the idea of them starting their own business and embracing technology that way. I'm very impressed with the connectivity and route to route to branch, I'd call it, top to bottom approach of the Netherlands and of New Zealand in particular. My own country, Ireland, has done okay, but I've been on the record saying I think they could do better. United States is a little all over the place, which is the nature of a very large country with so much innovation going on. I don't see the hubs as clearly as they could be. And that's perhaps an opportunity for certainly. I know St. Louis, and I know Raleigh, North Carolina, and I know that we've seen some in attempts in Silicon Valley, but Minneapolis. But I think there's more to come. It doesn't necessarily have to be one location in the United States. I'm sure it's going to be multiple. And but again, it's a nature of a very entrepreneurial, capitalist society that we've got lots of polls. Um, I have been disappointed a little bit in the AI, so-called AI superpowers, that they are not investing in agriculture as much as they could. Microsoft is probably the leader in terms of their commitment, but I'm sure ag tech, crop tech, livestock tech, uh, by the fact we have not seen as much happening as you would in fintech or as you would in, I don't know, many of the other industries probably seems less attractive to them. But that said, and I know, Ash, you've covered this on your podcast in the past, the scale of the opportunity is enormous. The gap between where we are and where we need to go to, it cannot be bridged without embracing new technology. We just can't get there. And the gains that could be achieved are therefore much greater than you could get perhaps in other more controlled industries. So I'm hoping that that will become attractive. Um, from a accelerator perspective, I've worked with Thrive in California. They do a great job. They've reviewed, as we know, over the years, and helped hundreds, if not thousands, of startups in the US and Canada and Australia to make some breakthroughs. And there are other examples, but I would generally say those are my comments without picking out individuals and saying this person's doing a phenomenal job. You don't find too many ag tech experts when it comes down to it. And I know when you get invited to conferences and I get invited to conferences, and you're thinking it's an honor and also great for the ego to be on stage. But aren't there more young people? Aren't there more people coming in? Not as many as you would imagine. And I think that we've got to look forward to hopefully fostering more of that as we move forward.
I think it's a interesting the reflection between fintech or just tech or and agriculture is I think there's a very it's easy to jump to the perspective that there's just bigger returns in other industries. So the potential profits are greater. So that's where that's why they get the investment. But the other thing, and this goes back to what we were discussing about the microbiome and all those other things, is that our food production systems are much, much more complicated and complex and so it's a bigger challenge to actually do things in them than the financial industry. It's not that the financial industry isn't complex, it's just that when you add the fact that most things are going on outside, you've got animals, you've got plants, which have got their own way of doing things, and then the very diverse array of people across multiple countries, multiple regions, etc. There's orders of magnitude more complexity in the agricultural systems or the food systems than many of the other industries that we have. So, how much do you think that that's a contributing factor that is one of the reasons why investment goes more to those other industries, or is it just basically the ease of returns?
All of those are true. So hard to argue with any of them. So firstly, let's start with the basics. If we're talking about the United States, which is where much investment comes from when it comes to innovation, even globally, startups quite often end up in the United States looking for money because that's where the money is, and there is a culture and a history of people investing in this area. So from that perspective, how many Americans are farmers? What percentage of the population? How many have encountered farming? How many actually understand where their food comes from and how it's produced? And would have half an idea as to how to create a startup with an answer to a problem that a farmer has. And I don't need to say it's a very small number. We talk about 2 million people being involved in agriculture, but I'm not even sure when it comes down to it, fundamentally, that's a real number. I'm sure it's a fraction of that, maybe even 200,000 really top level, I call it professionals involved in the production of food. So, how do you find a startup which typically is in a city to understand a problem, which is typically in the countryside? That bridging that gap has been a challenge, and farming has become increasingly specialized and harder to understand, and so therefore, being able to again understand that this is not your grandfather's or great grandfather's great grandmother's farming system. We just will repeat the piece about the more we're learning scientifically about what we do, the more we're realizing how little we actually understood in the first place. So that's another level of complexity to it. And yeah, if I grew up in a city, I probably read the financial pages at some stage and certainly invested some of my own money and have some sense of what the financial industry is. And I've bought a car and driven a car and believe I know what a car is. And I've had to use probably at some stage of my life pharmaceuticals to make my health better. I have a sense of so these other industries feel more transparent. They feel as though I understand what I'm going to invest and what I'm going to get out of it. Whereas when you're trying to attract investors into agriculture who have not been involved in agriculture, there's a leap that has to be made. And how comfortable they are with doing that, of course, is the question. We have the opportunity to tell a better story. I'm involved with, for example, Harp, company out of North Carolina that's got a natural alternative to Roundup the way it's being positioned, the way we positioned it is to not replace, but to be used in conjunction with to solve maybe some of the issues that we see with herbicides when we use them and how we use them. But nonetheless, most of the technology is not as transparent, not as understandable to the average person in the public, and that obviously brings its own challenges when we're looking for money to invest.
Increasingly, with guests on the podcast, the urban rural divide um, is raised as an issue that is impeding both progress on farms, but also the flow of money back to the research. In so many ways it's becoming a challenge. And I guess when you think of using technology or innovation to solve our agricultural and food production problems, and I'm very guilty of this as well. I jump into precision feeding or understanding the science or building the markets. It's not so much about how do you connect the different parts of a society to overcome some of those potential political or cultural hurdles. Do you think do you think there's an opportunity to sort of use technology in some of those other ways to try and, one, encouraging more younger people, which we need, because, the other thing about the farming community that or farmers, whether it's here in the United States or elsewhere, is they're a ever continually aging group of individuals. So we need young people no matter what's becoming in. But do we need to broaden our focus in terms of where technology could come in and focus on things like attracting young people and that urban rural divide, as well as the precision and productivity side of things?
It's like you're leading the witness here, because you know I'm going to agree with you. But of course, if we could develop better visual tools, for argument's sake, some form of virtual reality to allow people to see what we do, if we could gamify it, make it more attractive for people to learn about the production of food through through having fun through games. If we could do a better job of communicating through, I've been shocked to read some recent statistics on how children are being taught, how the requirement to be able to read a book from beginning to end is no longer apparently a part of a necessary part of an education process. You expect younger students now to read chapters, not books, and increasingly, even there, it's all been summarized into shorter and shorter sound bites or bite-sized parts that they can consume very quickly. But that is the nature of society. We're all, if we're not in Twitter, not in X, we're in some form. We're communicating in shorter forms. I was one time brought up short by somebody who said, well, you talk all about the problem of agriculture, but there are lots of other industries out there that are also feeling vilified and feel as though they're misunderstood. And he went through the car industry, the coal industry, tobacco, pharmaceuticals. Not sure I want to be in the category with all of them, but there you go. That's that's the nature. But yeah, there's an opportunity if we change the way we communicate. However, we need to be clear. Most of the time, we don't change. Most of the time, you go to an agricultural conference and you hear the same conversations in the same ways. I was leading a panel in Amsterdam there 10 days ago on antimicrobial resistance in animals. And it was just going to be too easy to talk about how nobody understands us, how we really use antibiotics for the right reasons, and it's to keep animals healthy and alive and happy. And but nobody outside of livestock understands this. What is the purpose of that conversation? That's just insiders speaking to insiders. If you don't learn how to communicate to people who don't come across these questions on a daily basis, and the complexities of those are every bit as great as everything we've spoken about, then we're never going to bridge that gap. So it is partially using the modern media, the modern communication tools that we have at disposition, and doing so in a way that is smart. But we also have to be clear. The purpose of this is not to convince other people in agriculture that we're doing the right thing. And a lot of the times I attend meetings where that's what I feel we're doing. We're just patting ourselves on the back or woe is me, commiserating with each other that nobody else understands. That is not going to move the needle at all. We have to learn how to change the way we speak such that people outside can understand what we do, why we do it. And if we're doing the wrong things, we have to change those as well.
I was recently listening to a BBC food program podcast, and it said that something like about 80% of the food that's produced is actually consumed within cities. So cities are, in some ways, or in many ways, they're the actual drivers of our food system because that's where the demand comes from, that's where the quality signals comes from, and that's also where the price signals are coming from. And more, there's sustainability and health signals coming from the city. There's a lot of people who still will buy on price, but given that the cities are driving the food systems through those signals, and this is something else and given the fact that the farmers are frequently feel increasingly squeezed between the costs of production, their profit margins, and increased regulatory or environmental or other requirements. Do you think we just need to come to terms with the fact that, our current system food is not highly valued enough and it's too cheap when we should actually be, you know, paying realistic prices for our food and paying more for farmers, and then there would be more likely to get the food that everyone wants and everyone needs.
Absolutely. We've seen the cost of food in the United States is well below 10%. I think it's 8% of our income we spend on food, accepting that there are certain segments of society which are paying an awful lot more than that. But the number is very, very small. And that includes eating outside the home. So the spend on food at home is probably something of the order of 3%, 3.5%, and maybe 4.5% outside of the home. So it's 8% total. These are extraordinarily low numbers. And are consumers willing to pay more for food? We already know the answer is no. And not to get political on this, but one of the candidates has stood up and said she was going to put a cap on food prices because they're so expensive, which I just found astonishing. I don't mean that again, suggest one candidate is better than the other. Everybody makes their choices for other reasons, but it's a very populist image that food is very expensive and that something needs to be done about the price of food. I would argue a little bit along the lines you did. We should be paying more for food and then allowing farmers to do the things we've asked them to do. The sustainability requirements, the measurement of carbon in the soils, the capturing of that carbon, some of the things we want to do with respect to making farming better. All of those are going to require extra investments by somebody. And what we've discovered historically is they don't come from food companies. They don't come from food retailers. They don't come from the government. They can't come from, inevitably, it's a farmer that has to make that investment. How do you do that when you're trading on razor thin margins, maybe even below razor thin? It's extremely difficult. I was at a conference in Spain. Somebody in Europe was speaking about this and saying, if we want to make changes, we have to learn how to pay a higher price for our food. We have to learn how to pay farmers more because that's the best way to change what we want to change. But it's also true people in cities are quite ignorant and don't necessarily even want to know entirely where and what was done. And I don't know how you change that, or do you want to change that because you're confronting people with things with truths that they don't want to know, and when they do know them, doesn't necessarily make them happier or more willing to pay more for it.
I was speaking to a Kansas cattleman earlier this year, and he was talking about the percentage of beef across the US that's graded as the highest quality standard, and that had gone from something like 30 odd percent 20 or 30 years ago up over two-thirds or up over 60 or 70% today. And the only signal that drove that change was that the market was prepared to pay a premium for better quality beef. And it shows that if those signals, and they're not, market signals are not particularly complex, come through, that farmers will and ranchers will change their behavior. Um, so, and there's other examples out there similar that show the same thing, that farmers will change their behavior due to those price signals.
Absolutely. But a grocery store also knows if they frontline a great price on milk, eggs, or beef, they will drive customers in the door. And as a result, we get to be the loss leader in some of those behaviors. And then there's other foods that I don't know, I'll pick out salmon or avocados or whatever, where they are not price sensitive and where they will walk through the door and pay a higher price. So the grocery store figures out how that all works and where to put those low priced items to drive to make you walk through loads of aisles to get to them. So for better or worse, that's where we are. And how we become the Eggland's best, to use an example of somebody who's revolutionized the egg business, or Horizon in the dairy business, or where you create chicken meat or pork, which can be sold for a higher value. Um, that is the key to unlocking a lot of this extra value, and that probably also requires us to bring in a level of transparency to explain what better things we're doing and how we're going to make sure we continue doing them. Yeah, it's not a simple task, but it's certainly a worthwhile one in my view.
We've drifted off the technology focus slightly. So
Going to happen. You were never going to stay on task on this one, but I'm glad you're going. Glad you're bringing us both back.
so I think one of the questions I'd want to ask you is that, farming systems, and it's a very arbitrary divide because everywhere's got its nuances. But in terms of technology development for the global north and the global south, how do you see the balance of fitting into the different environments and socioeconomic and cultural environments?
Tend to be a glass half full type of person, as you've heard. So I think in the case of Africa, we have seen innovation taking place. I was in Kenya, I guess about 4 months ago. Wasn't as enthused by the actual progress. In other words, a lot of things have started. Some of them, maybe more than should be, have been backed by outside agencies. Um, so you get the feeling that maybe the startups are chasing prizes and they're chasing grants rather than chasing market. That would concern me. But I saw some really interesting apps for example, for backyard chicken production, where you can record on your phone, where you can get videos to teach you, where you can do some trading, get paid, where you can order, where when you have a disease or a problem, you can put in your data and it can tell you, well, you should consider, feeding more protein, or that you might have some disease that you probably need to visit a veterinarian. So that's really simple, relatively cheap to develop, extraordinarily valuable for smallholders in Africa. In Brazil, obviously, always the converse. Food production is on a large scale. There are a tremendous number of ag tech startups in Brazil making really good progress on some of the bigger issues Brazil has about sustainability, traceability systems, making sure that if beef is JBS, for example, has been using a system to track every single cow that comes into their system and make sure it has not been in an area which is in a protected forested area because of the pressures they're getting externally. But nonetheless, the system itself is extremely impressive. And we see the same thing being done in soybeans and corn and satellite data being combined with information from the ground. So the global south is not being left behind in this. I think the ability to leapfrog, to take a technology and to avoid going through all of the ways in which Europe, the West, the United States evolved to be able to make that leap is tremendously exciting. I saw an awful lot of technology in China. Most of this technology is not coming out of China at the moment, tends to be staying in China, but it's pretty advanced. What I saw for dairy cows in particular, pigs and poultry a little bit further back, and they're extremely advanced, as you know, in the use of satellites and drones for crops such as cotton, precision application of disease control, fertilizer, irrigation, every aspect of it. So I would hope that we'll go back to more of a global environment when it comes to this technology. But at the moment, China is forging ahead in technology for China.
That is wonderful to hear. Is there any is there any particular example out of all the different things you've seen that excites you more than anything else?
We've lived in this, would I say, imaginary world where everybody wants to work on a farm and they love the idea of getting up in the morning at 4:30 and cleaning the milking parlor and milking the first cows by 5:15 and then milking them again at lunchtime and then milking them again in the evening. And we have discovered surprisingly that that's getting harder and harder to sell as a vision to young people. So robotics, the use of robotics is inevitably going to be the area I think that's going to grow the most in the next 5 years. Not robotically milking cows, robotically moving around animals, robotically picking things out of the field that is really backbreaking work, either weeds or in the case of strawberries, fruit, etc., etc. I think robotics in processing plants are a given. Nobody really loves the idea of working in a processing plant, particularly if it involves cutting up animals, cutting up meat. It's kind of a nasty, nasty thing to do. And mostly we've relied upon immigrants in almost every country in the world to do that work as a first step in the ladder to get into the country to earn the money to then pay for their kids to go to college and do something else. So robotics is where I see the most growth in the short term. Sensors, really interesting to know more about the environments, about how things are being done and more precision information. And back to AI, but how soon AI is for me is the 5 to 10 year plan. We obviously see it happening now, but I think we're going to see an awful lot more of it in 5 years' time.
Aidan, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. And before we go, is there anything else that you'd like to add that we haven't already discussed?
So there is actually. I see you at lots of conferences as well. So having heard some of my pontifications and thoughts, what does it trigger in you?
I'm meant to be the one who's asking the questions here, mate. That's
This is the end of it now. You're good. I get to throw one curveball back.
I think it's all about people at the end of the day, because as people are the customers, people are the ones who actually have to make decisions. So how do you help people make decisions? How do you work with their cultural and social backgrounds and their values? And you know, and you can't go head to head with people, because as soon as you start telling the old kind of neo-colonial "I am right, you're wrong" has been proven not to work at all. So I think in terms of I guess I go to throughout my career, I've always found that the social and cultural political challenges have been more challenging or difficult than the technical and the financial ones. So how do you work with people to understand and empathize with them, understand what their fears are, what their risks are, to bring them along on those journeys, and then use the amazing technologies and tools we have to better understand the biology of the systems, so that you can tweak that in various different ways. One area that I am particularly interested in or fascinated by is the whole epigenetic space, which is so gene
Mm.
expression. Yeah, genetics is hard coded. So you're born with whatever DNA, and but then how those genes are expressed is not hard coded. So say a ewe can have singles, triplets, or twins. Um, and there's a whole bunch of communications within the animal or within the cells that instigate that. People can be born with one colored eyes, and then after X number of years, their eyes change to a different color. Their DNA hasn't changed, but their gene expression has. So understanding how the different parts of ecosystems interact and communicate, I think is really exciting because that gives us a way of tweaking things without actually having to change with the DNA. And where that's really exciting is especially with anything that's perennial. You plant an almond tree or a apple tree, or you have a cow, and that DNA is locked in the day you put that in the ground or the day the cow's grown. Whereas the weather and the climate and the environmental conditions change. So if we understand those epigenetics, then we can manage that gene expression to suit the climate at that particular time rather than being linked back to the decision that was made all those years ago when you start the process.
Well, I really like that, Ash, and I think I worked initially in nutrigenomics, which is just basic gene expression. The epigenetics idea, or the idea that also could be looking back multiple generations for some of these impacts, is really, really important. I should, of course, have pointed out, I should have plugged my book. I forgot to plug my book. So I do
Please
have a
do.
book called The Future of Agriculture, a free download on agritechcapital.com. But the part that I didn't, and this is pointed out to me, I started working with Kincannon Reed, an executive search group, and they pointed out to me I hadn't written enough about people, and it's absolutely true. All of what we've talked about today is going to change the people we need in agriculture, change the people we should be hiring, to change the people, how people should be trained, what information, what knowledge they have when they come in. That's going to be another massive piece. It's not going to be always traditional skills. In fact, it shouldn't be traditional skills, and certainly should be people from much more varied, diverse background. That's going to be a critical part of making sure that these innovations are sticky, that they're accepted, and that we make the progress that we're talking about today.
Aidan, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks, Ash. Appreciate it. Look forward to seeing you at the next meeting.
You've been listening to the Ash Cloud with me, Ash Sweeting, in conversation with Aidan Connolly. If you've enjoyed listening to this conversation, please subscribe to Ash Cloud, where we'll be continuing to discuss the environmental, food security, social, cultural, and political challenges facing our food systems.